Evelyn stepped onto the plane with a calm dignity that belied the storm about to break, dressed in a plain tan hoodie, dark leggings, and scuffed sneakers that had clearly seen many miles on American roads. As a proud black woman who had weathered more than her fair share of prejudice in boardrooms and upscale lounges, she knew the cost of simply being herself. Today, however, she was not there to blend into the background. Even as she rolled a modest black suitcase behind her, every calculated step was a silent declaration of defiance against a world that had long misjudged her worth, based solely on appearances. When she entered the first-class cabin, the flight attendant named Cheryl immediately gave her a scrutinizing once-over. With a practiced smile that couldn't quite mask her disdain, Cheryl remarked in a tone that dripped with condescension, "First class is through here," as if Evelyn's boarding pass was a mistake rather than a fact. The subtle sneer in Cheryl's voice hinted at a long history of dismissing those who didn't look the part of the elite. And it wasn't long before the whispers started among the passengers. The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken prejudice. Nearby, a couple, Patrick and his wife Rachel, exchanged furtive glances and murmured comments as they watched Evelyn, who now took the seat marked 1A. The hushed remarks, laden with assumptions about her being an outsider, carried the familiar bite of racial bias that she had encountered far too often. While others assumed she must be a budget traveler, the truth was far more complex. Evelyn was a powerhouse, a woman who had built an airline empire from scratch, a fact hidden behind her unassuming appearance. The arrogance of those around her was palpable, their judgment based solely on outdated stereotypes that painted her as less than she truly was. Inside her seat, Evelyn's expression remained as composed as ever. She carefully placed her small tablet in her lap, her fingers lightly tapping the side in a rhythmic, almost meditative cadence. It was as if she was saying to herself, "I know who I am, and no one's petty bias will ever change that." The tension in the air grew heavier when Cheryl returned minutes later, her voice rising just enough for everyone to hear as she leaned in to question, "Ma'am, are you sure this is your seat? This section is reserved for our premium guests." There was an underlying insinuation in those words, as if Cheryl believed that a woman who looked so ordinary could not possibly belong among the high flyers. Evelyn's reply was quiet but firm. With an unwavering gaze, she held out her boarding pass, refusing to acknowledge the condescension in Cheryl's tone. Instead, she silently reminded herself of every time she'd been underestimated, simply because she wasn't dressed in designer labels or flaunting expensive accessories. Cheryl, visibly unsettled by Evelyn's calm defiance, snatched the boarding pass and muttered something about needing to verify it with the gate desk. In that brief moment, every passenger seemed to lean in a little closer, their eyes full of curiosity and judgment. The subtle stares and whispered comments weren't just about seating arrangements. They were about an unyielding, age-old prejudice that had no place in today's world, but still reared its ugly head in the most unexpected places. As Evelyn sat back and looked out the window, her eyes reflecting both a deep sadness and an almost imperceptible spark of determination, she knew that she had endured this sort of humiliation before. In every boardroom, in every upscale restaurant, she had been met with dismissive looks and unkind assumptions. But today, something was different. Even as Cheryl made a hasty call to the gate desk, reporting that there was a passenger in first class who doesn't look like she belongs here, Evelyn's mind was already working. She had faced discrimination and cruelty all her life, and she had learned to turn those moments of indignity into opportunities for subtle yet powerful retribution. Her phone buzzed softly with a message from the captain confirming that the situation was being monitored. While the other crew members continued to fuss over minor details, Evelyn's inner world was a whirlwind of memories, strategies, and plans for a response that would leave everyone astounded. She was not the helpless victim they assumed her to be. Instead, she was the orchestrator of a grand scheme, one that would expose the deep-seated racism and arrogance of those who had underestimated her. As the plane began to taxi and the murmurs among the passengers swelled into a chorus of discontent, Evelyn's calm exterior belied the tumult of emotions beneath. In her heart, she carried the weight of years spent fighting silent battles against a system that thrived on discrimination. She had learned to mask her pain with a serene facade, but every slight, every dismissive comment, every cold stare only added fuel to the fire of her resolve. Even when Patrick whispered to his wife about how someone dressed so plainly could be in first class, the undertone of racial bias in his voice did not escape Evelyn. It was the kind of casual prejudice that she had encountered all too many times in her life, and it stung deeply, even if she showed no outward sign of hurt. Meanwhile, Cheryl's behavior grew more erratic and aggressive. Back in the galley, as she recounted the situation to Megan in hushed yet cutting tones, it became clear that this was not merely a bureaucratic error to her. It was a personal affront, an opportunity to assert her authority and, in a twisted way, to validate her own biased perceptions of who belonged and who did not. "I've worked first class for 12 years, Cheryl snapped, her words laced with arrogance. "I know the type of people who sit up here." But Megan, a newcomer to the crew, could only whisper that Evelyn's ticket was, in fact, valid, and that she had done nothing wrong. Even as Megan's gentle voice tried to temper the rising hostility, Cheryl's face darkened with a mixture of anger and indignation, a stark reminder of how deep the roots of discrimination ran. All the while, Evelyn remained a quiet observer of the unfolding drama. With every dismissive gesture and every condescending remark, she felt the old wounds of racial injustice reopening. Yet she also felt a burgeoning sense of empowerment. In that moment, as the engines roared to life and the plane soared into the sky, Evelyn made a silent promise to herself. She would not only endure this humiliation, but would transform it into something much larger, a reckoning that would force everyone on board to confront their own prejudices. In the soft hum of the airplane cabin, she could almost hear the distant echoes of a justice long denied. With a simple tap on her tablet, she sent another message. The situation was now being logged, every slight recorded, every discriminatory comment noted for what it was, a marker of a system that was about to be exposed. The tension between Evelyn and Cheryl reached a boiling point when, after a long and uncomfortable silence, Cheryl returned to offer a drink. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked in a tone that was artificially sweet, as she set down a glass of sparkling water on the tray table. Evelyn looked up, her eyes steady and her voice calm as she replied, "You didn't offer me anything before takeoff." The comment hung in the air, charged with the weight of every overlooked courtesy and every dismissive act. Cheryl's face contorted into a look that was part shock, part fury, a reaction that only deepened the already palpable rift between them. The other passengers watched, their eyes wide, as if anticipating a dramatic confrontation that would finally settle the score between prejudice and quiet strength. As the flight continued and the cabin lights dimmed slightly in preparation for the cruising phase, Evelyn's mind wandered to the possibilities of what was to come. She recalled every moment of humiliation, the whispered comments, the covert glances, the casual dismissal of her presence, and in each, she saw the seeds of a grand retribution that would soon bloom. With a measured breath and a composed smile, she prepared herself for the inevitable reckoning. Soon, the full truth of who she was would be revealed, and the cruelty of those who had thought her insignificant would be laid bare for all to see. In that silent moment, as the plane cut through the vast American sky measured in miles per hour and high above the familiar landscapes, Evelyn vowed that her response would be as magnificent as it was just. It would be a response that not only silenced the doubters, but would also serve as a resounding declaration that true power is never defined by appearances, but by the resilience of the human spirit. And so, as the first-class cabin settled into a tense hush, every eye fixed on her unyielding figure, the stage was set for a confrontation that promised to be as epic as it was inevitable. a confrontation that would forever change the narrative of discrimination on this flight and beyond. Vivian raised a short, awkward smile as the tension in first class grew thicker than the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. At that moment, when Cheryl's voice wavered ever so slightly, Vivian simply nodded and replied in a soft, measured tone, "Well, I'm here now." She picked up the glass of sparkling water and took a delicate sip, her eyes never betraying any hint of the storm that raged within her. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as Cheryl, who had always prided herself on her polished professionalism, found herself at a loss for words. Standing there, her usual confident veneer crumbling, Cheryl could only manage a tight nod before turning away. As she walked back toward the galley with her face flushed and her mind buzzing with uncertainty, she began to question why this particular passenger stirred such deep discomfort within her. It was not the first time she had questioned a boarding guest, yet something about Vivian was different. The calm authority in Vivian's gaze and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself unsettled Cheryl to her core. Back in the cockpit, the captain's eyes flickered to the screen as another message arrived. "Continue monitoring cabin. Report after landing, priority 1A." His voice announced in an even, measured tone that betrayed nothing but an unyielding sense of duty. He exchanged a brief glance with his co-pilot, who murmured, "Better keep an eye on the front," to which the captain replied, "Not yet, but it's coming." Meanwhile, Vivian scrolled slowly through her tablet, pretending to read the safety manual, though every whisper and every shift in tone in the cabin was captured in her sharp mind. Across the aisle, Patrick, who had earlier sported a smirk, now sat quietly, and a hint of remorse clouded his eyes. As if he suddenly realized he might have misjudged the woman in seat 1. Even his wife, Rachel, sat stiffly, her fingers nervously clutching a magazine, silently acknowledging that something monumental was unfolding before their eyes. In the galley, Cheryl paced back and forth, her anxiety mounting with every step. That mysterious woman in seat 10A did not react like most passengers when challenged. There were no frantic protests, no flustered explanations, only a dignified silence that spoke volumes. This unnerving calm was something Cheryl had never experienced, and it gnawed at her sense of authority. Megan, a gentle soul new to the crew, quietly stacked snack trays beside her and asked, "Did she say anything to you?" Cheryl shook her head, her jaw tightening as she admitted, "Not really. She just gave me that look, like she thinks she's better than me." Megan offered a soft reply, "Maybe she's just not like the others, but that doesn't mean she's wrong." Cheryl's eyes flashed with anger as she muttered, "She doesn't belong up here. I have worked in first class for 12 years. I know when something's off." Before Megan could add another word, the intercom crackled, and the captain's smooth, calm voice instructed, "Cheryl, please report to the cockpit." In that instant, Cheryl's stomach dropped as she realized that being called mid-flight was never a good sign. Heart pounding, Cheryl hurried toward the cockpit, each step heavy with dread. Vivian watched her leave without a trace of a smile or any reaction at all. Her expression remained as steady and inscrutable as ever. Inside the cockpit, the captain's face was stern but controlled as he motioned for Cheryl to close the door behind her. "There is something you need to know," he said quietly. "Seat 1A, the woman you confronted at boarding, is not just a passenger." Cheryl's eyes widened in disbelief as the captain continued, "She is the new owner of this airline." The words struck Cheryl like a lightning bolt, her confidence shattering instantly. The captain turned the screen toward her, revealing a message flagged by corporate with executive override permissions. The message clearly identified the passenger as Vivian Bennett, the majority shareholder and the new CEO. The revelation sent a chill down Cheryl's spine as her throat went dry and her knees weakened. I didn't know," she stammered, struggling to find any justification for her earlier behavior. The captain's eyes narrowed slightly as he pressed on. "You better hope this mistake is fixable, because when we land there will be questions from corporate and beyond." Cheryl stood frozen, the weight of her error settling over her like a heavy fog. She had challenged the woman who now held the reins of the entire company, and the consequences of her rash assumptions were about to be laid bare. In the first-class cabin, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. Vivian continued to sit quietly, her calm demeanor unwavering despite the storm that had just erupted. She turned a page on her tablet and reached for her water again, taking a measured sip as if every gesture was part of a larger, well-rehearsed plan. The energy in the cabin was thick with anticipation and regret as passengers began to piece together the unfolding drama. Patrick now avoided eye contact completely, and Rachel's earlier smirk had dissolved into a look of unease. Whispers passed quietly among the other guests, their postures shifting as they realized that the balance of power had dramatically changed. Vivian's phone buzzed softly in her bag, and when she glanced at it, she saw a message that read, "Captain confirmed. Incident logged. Post-landing arrangements being prepared." Without any trace of panic or anger, she placed the phone down and resumed her silent vigil, her eyes reflecting both a deep sadness and a burning determination for retribution. Megan, who had been quietly attending to the rest of the passengers, kept casting concerned glances toward Cheryl, who now stood motionless beside the drink cart. The once domineering flight attendant now appeared vulnerable and lost, her polished shoes clicking along the aisle with a feeble rhythm that betrayed her shaken state. After a few long seconds, Cheryl inched her way toward Vivian's seat. With a forced politeness, she crouched slightly and said in a low, strained voice, "Ms. Bennett, there has been a misunderstanding. I would like to offer my apologies." But Vivian did not look up from her tablet. Instead, she continued reading, her eyes cool and unwavering, as if daring Cheryl to justify her earlier actions. Cheryl's words faltered as she tried again. I didn't know who you were. I thought there was an error with the seating." Vivian slowly turned her head, locking eyes with Cheryl in a moment that felt like it stretched on for an eternity. "You didn't question anyone else," Vivian said steadily. "I showed you my ticket twice, and yet you still tried to remove me." The words hung in the air, and for a moment time seemed to freeze as Cheryl's face burned with shame and anger. Around them, a few passengers had started listening intently, while others pretended not to notice the charged confrontation. Cheryl's voice trembled as she looked around, desperate for some escape from the judgmental eyes. "I didn't mean to, but you didn't ask the man in 1B or the woman in 2A to prove anything," Vivian continued, her tone laced with the quiet fury of someone who had endured countless injustices. The sting of her words cut deep, exposing not only Cheryl's bias, but also her desperate need to cling to a crumbling sense of authority. In that instant, the entire cabin seemed to share in Vivian's silent triumph, each passenger feeling a mix of pity for the fallen flight attendant and admiration for the dignified strength of the new CEO. Cheryl's apology felt hollow, and when she finally mumbled a weak, "I'm sorry," it was clear that her contrition was as empty as her previous assumptions. As the plane continued its steady hum toward the runway, the lingering silence after Cheryl's feeble apology was as oppressive as the humid summer air over a Midwestern highway. Vivian, sitting with an air of quiet resolve, knew that this was only the beginning of a reckoning that would ripple far beyond the confines of this single flight. She had spent years fighting the subtle and overt injustices that marred her journey, and now she was determined to turn every slight, every discriminatory remark into a resounding declaration of her rightful power. With the revelation of her true identity, the seeds of revenge and retribution had been sown. Every discriminatory glance and every whispered judgment was about to be repaid in full. The quiet dignity with which she carried herself was now a promise that those who had wronged her would soon witness a comeback so magnificent that it would leave them reeling in disbelief. In that charged moment, as the plane soared steadily through the skies measured in miles per hour and the distant horizon beckoned with the promise of a new beginning, Vivian Bennett silently vowed that her response would be as grand as it was just. She would not be defined by the cruelty of those who doubted her. Instead, she would rise, and in doing so, transform every slight into a beacon of empowerment for all who had ever been underestimated. Vivian Bennett sat in seat 1A with a dignified stillness that spoke louder than any harsh word ever could. Her focus was elsewhere, and she didn't need to say another thing because the weight of that charged moment had done its work. Every passenger who had stared, whispered, or looked away was now painfully aware of her presence. Not because she demanded attention, but because the truth had finally struck them hard enough to leave no room for ignorance. Meanwhile, in the cramped confines of the galley, Cheryl stood hidden behind the counter, gripping its edge with trembling hands and shallow breaths. Every sideways glance, every subtle shift of an eye, and every quiet judgment in that moment was a reminder of the costly mistake she had made, a mistake that could not be undone. Cheryl hadn't dared to return to the cabin since Vivian had spoken. Each step down that aisle would force her to relive the moment when she had misjudged a woman simply because of the way she looked. In that silent space, every passenger's gaze became an echo of disapproval, and the collective judgment hung in the air like a heavy fog. Megan, ever gentle and efficient, moved about the cabin with soft smiles and kind words, yet her eyes kept drifting toward Vivian's seat, as if to silently check whether the remarkable woman needed anything. It was evident that this calm was only the brief lull before the real storm. A storm that promised not only retribution, but a reckoning for years of unchallenged bias and cruelty. Across the aisle, Patrick and his wife Rachel exchanged quiet murmurs laden with regret. In a low voice that barely broke the silence, Patrick admitted, "I think I heard everything. I judged her too quickly." His tone, heavy with remorse, was met by Rachel's silent nod and the unspoken acknowledgement that they, too, had played a part, even if only through their silence, in upholding a system of prejudice. It wasn't just Cheryl who had misjudged Vivian. Nearly every soul in that first-class cabin had contributed to a collective oversight that now, in the face of undeniable truth, left them feeling small and complicit. Up in the cockpit, the captain received another message from the ground. Final protocol in place. On-ground security and the executive team will meet the flight. Passenger 1A is to remain seated until escorted. All crew must comply with instructions post-landing. His voice was measured and calm, yet every word carried the promise of impending consequences. Adjusting his headset, he murmured to his co-pilot, "She's not just reviewing this flight. She's making an example." Those words resonated deeply, hinting at a retribution that would extend far beyond the confines of this one flight. Back in the galley, Cheryl paced restlessly, her hands trembling as her inner resolve crumbled under the weight of her actions. Her entire career had been built on order, routine, and strict adherence to rules she had enforced with an iron fist. But today, it wasn't merely a breach of protocol. It was a grievous error of judgment, born from an ingrained bias that had blinded her to the truth. She had acted on what she saw instead of what she knew, and now that error was poised to redefine everything. Megan stepped in quietly, her voice gentle and free of reproach, saying, "You need to get ready." The warning, simple yet profound, made Cheryl close her eyes as she struggled to gather words of defense. "I thought I was just doing my job," she whispered, almost inaudibly. Megan replied softly, "You weren't just doing your job, you were doing what you thought was right, and that isn't the same thing." Those words, filled with both pity and truth, hung in the air as an inescapable reminder of the difference between rigid adherence to rules and the compassionate pursuit of justice. Vivian, for her part, continued to sit with an unwavering calm. She picked up her phone and sent one final, measured message. "All confirmed. I'll remain seated. Proceed as planned." It wasn't a call for revenge, but a quiet insistence on change. A declaration that the broken system needed to be exposed for exactly how flawed it was. Vivian wasn't out for personal retribution. She craved transformation. Each subtle movement, every measured gesture, spoke of a strength honed over years of enduring and overcoming injustice. In that silence, she was not the victim. They were the ones who had chosen ignorance over empathy. As the plane cruised steadily at 35,000 feet, the cabin became a stage for an unfolding drama. On the ground, preparations were already underway for what was to come. A soft chime from the intercom announced the beginning of the descent. The captain's calm voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and return your tray tables to the upright position." The usual efficiency of boarding was replaced by hesitant, almost reluctant movements, as if every action was weighed down by the heavy burden of guilt. The atmosphere in first class was no longer one of relaxed luxury. It was charged with tension and regret. Those who had once looked down on Vivian now avoided eye contact, ashamed of the part they had played. Patrick tugged awkwardly at his seatbelt and leaned toward Vivian's seat to murmur, I just wanted to say what happened earlier was wrong." Vivian turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes with a calm yet penetrating look. "People always assume," she said quietly, "and when they're wrong, they choose silence." Her words, soft but piercing, left no room for excuses, forcing everyone to confront their own complicity. Meanwhile, the captain's final update came through. "Passenger 1A is seated. Protocol is in motion." At the gate, a sleek black car waited beside the terminal, flanked by 2 security officers in Navy uniforms and a senior airline executive with an unwavering professional demeanor. They had been briefed on every detail and understood the gravity of the situation. Every precaution was in place to ensure accountability and to show that the era of unchecked discrimination was finally drawing to a close. Inside the plane, Cheryl's internal turmoil reached its peak. She clutched the jump seatbelt tightly as she stared at the back of the cockpit door, replaying every moment of her confrontation with Vivian. The way she had smiled too tightly, the way she had tried to belittle a woman who possessed an undeniable power. Now every memory stung like a lash. Her polished shoes clicked along the aisle, but that sound was no longer confident. It was the sound of a woman burdened by guilt and fear. The aircraft's wheels touched down with a soft, steady bump, and as the seatbelt sign flicked off, the most daunting moment still loomed ahead. The door to the aircraft swung open with a smooth hiss, and a rush of cooler, heavier air filled the cabin. In that moment, every first-class passenger sat in a state of frozen anticipation, eyes fixed forward, breaths held in unison, as if they were all witnesses to history in the making. Vivian's posture remained impeccable, upright and composed, with her bag neatly zipped and her hands resting calmly on her lap. The quiet power she exuded had only grown stronger, as if every silent judgment and every whispered reproach had only served to solidify her resolve. From the open door, a tall man in a charcoal suit stepped in, his badge clearly reading Senior Operations. His face was a mask of professionalism and authority, and behind him, 2 security officers in Navy uniforms followed with measured, focused steps. They were not there to instill fear, but to ensure that accountability was upheld. Every passenger watched in hushed silence as he began to speak in a firm, resolute tone. This was the moment when long overdue justice would be served. Cheryl, watching from her hidden spot, felt her world shatter under the weight of her own conscience. The consequences of her actions were now inescapable, and she could only brace herself for what was to come. In that charged instant, as the senior officer's words reverberated through the cabin, it became undeniably clear that the era of bias and unchecked prejudice was drawing to a close. The cool, crisp air that had swept through first class heralded the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where respect, fairness, and accountability would no longer be optional. Every detail of the encounter was now etched into the hearts and minds of those who bore witness, marking the end of a broken system and the dawn of a more just future. Vivian Bennett remained seated in first class as the final act of the day unfolded around her, every moment intensifying the charged atmosphere that had built up over the course of the flight. At the scene, a group of well-dressed onlookers sat in silence, feigning disinterest while their eyes darted behind sunglasses, newspapers, and practiced yawns. As if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred, a sharply dressed man in a charcoal suit methodically scanned the cabin until his steely gaze finally rested on Cheryl Martin, who stood rigid and pale just inside the galley. His voice, firm and authoritative, broke the fragile silence as he addressed her. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you. Please collect your belongings and step out with us." Cheryl's lips trembled and she opened her mouth, only to clench it shut again as fear and regret battled within her. With shaking hands, she reached for the blazer that hung near the service hatch, her legs feeling as if they were weighed down by lead. As she forced herself to move forward, every step along the aisle became an agonizing reminder of the authority she had once wielded with pride. A pride that had evaporated in the wake of Vivian's quiet, yet damning presence. Passengers who had once admired Cheryl's strict efficiency now watched her with a mix of discomfort and judgment, their eyes following her with unspoken disapproval. When she passed by Vivian's row, she hesitated for a split second, as if longing to offer some apology or explanation, but Vivian's unyielding gaze and composed silence made it clear that nothing more needed to be said. Lowering her head in defeat, Cheryl continued her slow, reluctant march as the executive in the suit allowed her to pass before following closely behind with two uniformed officers. In that moment, even Patrick and Rachel, who had earlier played a part in the silent complicity of the cabin, exchanged looks of shock and remorse. Rachel let out a long, regretful sigh, while Patrick cleared his throat in stunned silence, acutely aware that the balance of power had shifted so dramatically in the span of a few minutes. The finality of the situation hit as Cheryl stepped off the aircraft and the door closed behind her with a resounding thud that seemed to echo the finality of her fall from grace. Inside the terminal, she was hurriedly led down a side hallway away from the bustling crowd of arriving passengers. Every step she took in the familiar corridors of the airport now felt foreign and heavy, as if the very ground beneath her had become an unforgiving reminder of her past mistakes. Escorted into a small conference room with frosted glass walls, her heart pounded furiously in her ears, drowning out any hope of redemption. There, an imposing executive awaited, a woman with piercing, sharp eyes and a calm, unyielding voice that carried the weight of corporate authority. A folder lay open on the table as she motioned for Cheryl to sit down. "Please sit," the woman said, in a tone that brooked no argument. "We have reviewed the incident on Flight 119. Cheryl, her knees unsteady, sank into the chair, feeling the full brunt of her actions crushing her spirit. She tried to muster the confidence that had once defined her, but her voice quivered as she attempted to explain. "I didn't know who she was. She didn't look like..." Before she could finish, the executive raised a hand to silence her. "This is not about who she is," she stated clearly. "It's about what you assumed, and, more importantly, how you acted." Cheryl fell silent as the executive opened the folder, revealing a detailed timeline of the entire flight, printed statements, crew reports, and internal messages from the cockpit, all meticulously compiled. "You have served this airline for many years," the executive continued, "but this is not the first report regarding your conduct in first class. It is simply the first one you could no longer ignore or walk away from." Cheryl's throat went dry, and when the woman closed the folder, her next words were delivered with cold finality. "Effective immediately, you are placed on unpaid suspension. A full review will determine if your position with this airline continues." Desperation and fear mingled in Cheryl's eyes as she managed to ask, "Is there anything I can do?" The executive's reply was measured and uncompromising. "Maybe, but it starts with acknowledging the difference between following policy and enforcing prejudice." There was no rebuttal to be made. Cheryl had nothing left to defend, and her silence confirmed the truth that had long been ignored. Back on the plane, Megan continued her gentle work, clearing trays, offering final goodbyes, her quiet compassion a stark contrast to the cruelty that had just unfolded. Approaching Vivian's row, Megan's soft voice broke through the lingering tension as she said, "Ms. Bennett, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. Not just what happened, but that no one stepped in sooner." For the first time, Vivian lifted her eyes from her tablet and regarded Megan with a look that combined gratitude with a measured resolve. "You did more than most," she replied quietly, a small but sincere nod acknowledging Megan's empathy. "If there is anything you need, anything at all, please let me know." Megan's expression softened with a mix of relief and sorrow as Vivian continued down the aisle, her every step deliberate and imbued with the heavy weight of change. Each step was not only a move away from the traumatic past, but a march toward a future where the broken system would finally be forced to confront its own reflection. At the top of the jet bridge, the same executive from earlier awaited by the gate. With a polite yet firm tone, he greeted Vivian. "Ms. Bennett, your car is ready. The press has been informed of a closed-door briefing only." Vivian acknowledged with a subtle nod, a gesture that conveyed both respect and determination. Walking side by side toward the private exit, she made it clear that her actions were not for attention, but for accountability and transformation. Outside, the sleek black sedan waited under the early afternoon sun, its engine humming quietly as tinted windows shielded its interior from prying eyes. As Vivian stepped out of the terminal with the executive, the weight of the entire flight still clung to her like a shadow. The brief walk to the car, which in another time would have seemed routine, now stretched out as an arduous crossing over a metaphorical runway of reckoning. Inside the car, silence reigned as Vivian gazed out the window. The passing cityscape, a mosaic of tall buildings, winding highways, and sunlit streets, reflected back her resolute expression. She thought about the countless passengers who had flown before her, many of whom had been subject to baseless judgments and prejudiced assumptions. The memory of her late father's words echoed in her mind. "The sky may not care who you are, but those within the cabin certainly do." This realization, painful and profound, steeled her resolve to dismantle the outdated systems of judgment that had long reigned unchecked. After a few moments, her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. Vivian retrieved it and read a message from the board liaison confirming that a review meeting had been scheduled for that very afternoon. "Would you like to attend in person or remotely?" the message asked. Without hesitation, Vivian typed back, "In person," and placed the phone aside. The smooth leather of the car seat was cool beneath her, but her mind was ablaze with thoughts of reform. She was not fueled by anger in the conventional sense. Rather, she was driven by a desire for lasting change. What she sought was not a momentary outburst of revenge, but a profound cultural shift. A transformation that would drag long-hidden prejudices into the harsh light of day, where they could no longer be tolerated. The car soon pulled into the underground parking entrance of the airline's headquarters, where familiar faces from her father's era and current senior leadership awaited her. As Vivian stepped out and entered the executive wing, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Hushed conversations died down as all eyes turned toward her. No longer would she be the quiet presence in the back of boardrooms. Today, she was here to lead. Without pausing to exchange pleasantries, Vivian strode directly to the head of the conference table and carefully placed her bag down. Lydia, the head of policy and compliance, rose to greet her warmly yet formally. "Ms. Bennett, thank you for coming in person," Lydia said. Vivian's response was a simple nod, her expression steady and resolute. The meeting began with a large monitor displaying images from the flight boarding records, crew assignments, internal messages, a digital footprint of the incident that could not be erased. Lydia opened a file and explained, "We have reviewed the full timeline. Cheryl Martin has been suspended pending further investigation. While she has admitted to making assumptions, we have also received 2 additional reports referencing similar behavior on previous flights." Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly as she interjected, "And why was no action taken at the time?" Lydia's tone tightened as she explained that many passengers did not file formal complaints because they felt ignored or believed nothing would change. Vivian's response was clear and uncompromising. "That ends now. I have prepared a draft policy that includes mandatory bias awareness training for all staff, an anonymous passenger reporting system, and randomized reviews of first-class service footage. Every report, formal or informal, must be logged and acted upon. Anyone who views a passenger as a problem simply because they do not conform to a narrow definition of wealth has no place in our service. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, though one voice from the far end hesitated, asking if such measures might create resistance from the union. Vivian's reply was polite yet firm. They can resist fair treatment if they wish, but not while wearing our uniform. Lydia looked up from the folder and, with Vivian's resolute nod, confirmed. We will push this forward today. It will be made public. I refuse to let this be buried in an email. Our commitment to justice must be clear to everyone. For the next 30 minutes, the meeting delved into details, timelines, and policy language with a tone that reflected not only urgency, but a fundamental shift in corporate culture. Every leader in the room recognized that what had happened on Flight 118 was more than a single mistake. It was a mirror held up to a broken system that had long tolerated discrimination. As the meeting drew to a close, no one dared question Vivian's authority or her intentions. In that moment, she was not just a victim of prejudice. She was a catalyst for change, a beacon of hope for those who had suffered in silence for far too long. Vivian Bennett's response was not one of explosive revenge, but rather a dignified, systemic overhaul that promised to transform the airline from within. Her steady, unyielding demeanor and unwavering commitment to fairness served as a resounding declaration that true power lies in the courage to confront injustice head-on, and as the room began to disperse, the echoes of that historic meeting resonated far beyond the confines of the boardroom, marking the dawn of a new era where every act of prejudice would be met with decisive, transformative action. Vivian Bennett stood at the head of the boardroom with the quiet dignity that had carried her through the turbulent flight. When the meeting ended, she slowly gathered her things. Lydia, head of policy and compliance, spoke softly as Vivian reached the door. "Ms. Bennett, one more thing." That simple request hung in the air like a final reminder that the day's events were not over yet. A written apology from Cheryl Martin had been submitted, and Lydia asked if Vivian would read it now. Vivian paused for a moment, her eyes fixed on the steady hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, then shook her head and replied in a calm tone, "Not yet." With that, she walked out of the boardroom. Vivian was not finished with the injustice that had unfolded. Rather, she was only getting started on a long overdue reckoning. Stepping out of the conference room, Vivian carried herself with the same quiet grace that had defined her presence during the flight. But as the heavy door closed behind her, the weight of the day pressed upon her shoulders. The corridors of headquarters, once filled with memories of her father's determined footsteps and countless meetings where he fought for respect, now felt colder and more forbidding. Vivian remembered those days when she trailed behind him through endless boardrooms, learning that one could speak softly and still be heard. Today, every step she took echoed those lessons, and every step was a reminder that she now stood as a symbol of accountability and change. As she passed framed portraits of past executives and navigated open-plan offices where employees busied themselves at keyboards, Vivian noticed the few who looked up as she walked by. Their expressions were a mixture of curiosity, respect, and a dawning awareness that the legacy of old prejudices was coming under scrutiny. No longer was she just the new CEO or the owner's daughter. She had become the living embodiment of a new era, one where those who enforced narrow, biased views would finally have to answer for their actions. Her stride was steady and measured, each step a declaration that injustice would no longer be tolerated. Vivian reached her corner office, a sanctuary filled with soft, natural light from a large window overlooking the city. The door clicked shut behind her and she placed her bag on a small table before slowly walking to her desk and sitting down. For a few long moments, she simply stared at the large computer screen in front of her. There were no urgent messages or flashing alerts, only the soft glow of a desktop that had been silent for too long. She opened her inbox and found over 200 new emails, some from corporate teams, some from news outlets, and many from passengers who had witnessed the day's events. Instead of reacting immediately, she navigated to a folder labeled Incident Reports and found at the very top one message with the subject, Formal Apology, from Cheryl Martin. Vivian hovered the mouse over it, then moved it aside, not because she was angry, but because she already understood the truth in plain view. The apology was not the problem. It was the mindset behind it. Just then, her assistant Leo, a sharp and organized young man, knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. "Vivian," he said in a clear, respectful tone, "the press team is requesting a public statement. They want to know if you will speak on the record." Vivian looked up from the computer, her eyes thoughtful. "They already know, don't they?" she replied softly, recalling that someone from the flight had posted photos and a short video online of Cheryl being escorted off the plane. Leo confirmed, "Yes, the video is circulating widely. Some are calling it a power move, while others are praising you for staying calm. A few are even saying you embarrassed her." Vivian raised her eyebrows and leaned back in her chair. "I did not embarrass her," she stated evenly. "She embarrassed herself by the choices she made." Leo hesitated before adding, "You should know, a former employee just reached out. She said that Cheryl had done something similar to her last year, and no one believed her at the time." Vivian closed her eyes for a moment as the weight of that admission hit her harder than she expected. "Get her on a call," she said softly, "and tell her we are listening now." Leo nodded and left the room, leaving Vivian alone with her thoughts. Across the city, in a modest apartment with drawn curtains and a silent phone, Cheryl Martin sat on the edge of her bed. Dressed in yesterday's clothes, she stared at the email she had just sent, a desperate written apology meant to fix something already broken. Her trembling hands reached for a glass of water, but even that small act felt monumental as she realized the depth of her mistake. All her life, Cheryl had believed that fairness was simply following the rules. Now, faced with the undeniable truth that fairness only mattered when applied to people who fit a certain image, she saw her reflection in the cold light of her television. A news segment was covering the flight incident, showing photos of Vivian boarding the plane, a blurred video of Cheryl being escorted off, and a panel of commentators discussing racial bias in first-class service. Though Cheryl had not always seen herself as a villain, the world was beginning to see her as an example, a lesson in how unchecked prejudice can ruin lives. The apology she had sent was not enough to erase the judgment now cast upon her, nor would it change the fact that her actions had contributed to a culture of bias. Meanwhile, back at headquarters, Vivian opened a new document and began typing a statement not for the press, but for every employee who had ever doubted someone simply because they did not fit a preconceived image of wealth and status. She wrote for the silenced customers, for the former employee who had been pushed out without a second thought. Her words were not fiery or vindictive, they were steady and resolute. "Respect is not a benefit of a job title," she typed. "It is a baseline expectation. If anyone in this company cannot offer that respect equally to every customer, they should not be here." She continued, "What happened on Flight 118 is not solely about me. It is about every person who has ever been told, directly or indirectly, that they do not belong. Our goal is not merely to revise a policy. It is to reset our entire culture." After reading her statement several times to ensure that every word resonated with the urgency and compassion she felt, Vivian sent it to the internal communications team with a directive to share it company-wide. She wanted the world to see that this was not about personal revenge, but about fixing a system that had long allowed prejudice to fester. The next morning, the world had already begun to shift. Vivian arrived at headquarters before the sun had fully lit the city's skyline. The halls were nearly empty, but the buzz of conversation was palpable. News articles flashed across tablets and office monitors. Headlines screamed about an airline CEO who had remained composed under fire. about an executive passenger who had forced a change in company policy overnight, and about the flight that had become a catalyst for confronting racial bias in service. Social media was ablaze with the 15-second viral video of Cheryl walking past the first-class rows, her posture stiff and her face pale, while Vivian sat silently, her gaze unwavering. That single image had become a symbol, and Vivian had transformed herself into an example for all who had once been judged by appearance alone. Entering her office with a cup of steaming coffee in one hand and her bag slung over her shoulder, Vivian found Leo standing nearby, scrolling through his tablet. "We have over 30 interview requests," he informed her. 3 talk shows, 2 business panels, and even a national news anchor is offering a private interview." Vivian set her coffee down calmly and replied, "This is not a campaign." Leo nodded, understanding her resolve. "How about internally?" she asked. "We sent your statement company-wide last night, and it is being shared like wildfire. Department heads are scheduling sensitivity training sessions, and our policy review team says this was the biggest overnight employee engagement spike in years." Vivian leaned against the edge of her desk, her eyes reflecting both determination and a quiet sadness. "Did we receive any pushback?" she inquired. Leo hesitated and then said, "Some senior staff think it was too much too fast. One even mentioned that you made an example out of Cheryl." Vivian's expression remained impassive as she replied, "I did not make an example of her. She made herself the example." Leo gave a tight nod and added that the former flight attendant, the one who had been forced out last year, had agreed to speak with HR and would be coming in tomorrow. Vivian's jaw tightened as she murmured, "We failed her once, let us not fail her again." Later that day, as the city's evening lights began to twinkle, Cheryl sat alone in her modest apartment, dressed in yesterday's worn clothes. Her inbox had flooded with messages, some filled with cruel mockery, others with brutal honesty, and a few from friends and coworkers who reached out in support. One message from her younger sister simply read, "Did you really say that to her?" and left Cheryl with a heavy silence. She refreshed her screen repeatedly, hoping for a sign that her apology had been acknowledged, but nothing came. Every passing hour deepened the realization that she was no longer the victim of misunderstanding. She was responsible for her own downfall. All her life she had defined people by how they looked and carried themselves, never suspecting that her own bias was the true enemy. Watching the short video clip of herself, her stiff walk, the fear in her eyes, and the humiliation that played out so publicly, Cheryl could no longer recognize the person in the mirror. She did not like what she saw, but she knew that was her, and there was no escape from the truth. Meanwhile, at headquarters, Vivian sat in the main conference room with the training division, her mind focused on the future of the company. The meeting, which addressed new training programs, sensitivity workshops, and a complete review of service protocols, marked the beginning of a cultural reset. Vivian's calm yet resolute voice filled the room as she explained that the incident on Flight 118 was a mirror reflecting the deep-seated biases that had to be confronted and dismantled. Every detail, every timeline, and every policy revision was designed not to shame one individual, but to transform the organization from within. As she spoke, it was clear to every senior leader present that Vivian Bennett was not only steering her company toward greater accountability, but also setting a new standard for fairness and respect in an industry long tarnished by discrimination. Vivian's journey that day, from the turbulent skies to the cold corridors of corporate power, had reshaped her role from a silent observer to a fearless advocate for change. And in doing so, she turned her personal trials into a beacon of hope for countless others who had ever been told they did not belong. Veronica Taylor stood before a full room of directors, trainers, and department leads, every eye fixed on her as she prepared to launch a new initiative that would forever change the way her airline operated. On the screen behind her, the first slide of her presentation boldly declared, "Before the uniform, what you see, what you assume, what must change." In a measured, deliberate tone, Veronica began, "We do not teach perception. we teach procedures." Her voice carried the weight of years spent battling discrimination and prejudice, and every word was meant to dismantle the old ways of thinking that had long poisoned the industry. As she walked to the screen and tapped the remote, the image changed to reveal a plain, empty, first-class cabin. "This is what the average crew member sees on any given day," Veronica explained. "For someone like me, or anyone who does not fit the image they expect, this space becomes a test. A test of patience, dignity, and of how far someone is willing to go before asking, 'Do you belong here?'" Her words resonated deeply with the room, drawing attention to the silent judgments that had defined the service experience for too long. With another click, a still frame appeared on the screen showing the moment when a flight attendant, Cheryl Martin, had confronted her on board. The image was stark and unflinching, a frozen testament to a moment of raw prejudice. Veronica let the silence stretch before she continued. "I do not want apologies. I want awareness." The room fell quiet, every person present absorbing the truth in her voice. Then, in an unexpected turn, she clicked once more to display a short letter, a written apology from Cheryl Martin. Reading it aloud, Veronica's voice softened as she recited, "I now understand that I did not just doubt your seat. I doubted your right to be in that space because you did not fit what I expected. That was not about protocol, that was about bias, and I carry that mistake fully." She paused, letting the words hang in the air before turning back to the group. "This is not about punishing Cheryl. It is about ensuring that there are no more Cheryls in our midst, not because people fear consequences, but because we have been taught to see differently." A hand was raised near the back of the room, and one of the department leads asked, "Do you think she truly meant that apology?" Veronica paused thoughtfully and replied, "I do not know, but even if she did not mean it when she wrote it, perhaps hearing it out loud in this forum will inspire someone else to mean it when it matters." When the meeting finally ended, the usual rush to leave was replaced by lingering silence and quiet contemplation. Several people approached Veronica afterwards to express their gratitude, while others left without a word, their faces etched with a complex blend of recognition and regret. Later that evening, Veronica returned to her corner office, a space bathed in soft light from a large window that overlooked the twinkling city skyline. The airline's logo shimmered on a distant tower, a symbol of her father's dream that she had now inherited and transformed into a platform for change. As she set her bag on a small table near the window and sat at her desk, she took a deep breath and opened her inbox. Over 200 new emails awaited her attention. Many were from corporate teams, news outlets, and passengers who had witnessed the flight. Rather than reacting impulsively, she navigated to a folder marked Incident Reports and found one email at the top with the subject, "Formal Apology from Cheryl Martin." Veronica hovered the cursor over it before moving on. She was not ready to dwell on that apology because she already knew that the issue was not merely about one person's remorse. It was about a mindset that had to be eradicated. Just then, her assistant Leo, a meticulous young man known for his precision, knocked lightly and entered the office. "Veronica," he said in a clear, respectful tone, "the press team is requesting a public statement. They want to know if you will speak on the record." Veronica looked up, her eyes steady and reflective. "They already know, don't they?" she remarked, recalling the flood of social media posts, photos, and a short video clip of Cheryl being escorted off the plane. Leo confirmed, "Yes. The video is circulating widely. Some are calling it a power move, while others praise you for staying calm. A few even say you embarrassed her." Veronica raised her eyebrows and leaned back in her chair. "I did not embarrass her," she said firmly. "She embarrassed herself with her actions." Leo hesitated before adding, "There is also a message from a former employee who said that Cheryl treated her the same way last year and was silenced when she tried to speak up." Veronica closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that revelation. "Get her on a call," she said softly, "and let her know we are listening now." Leo nodded and left, leaving Veronica alone with her thoughts. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment on the other side of town, Cheryl Martin sat on the edge of her bed, dressed in yesterday's clothes, staring at the email she had just sent, a desperate, heartfelt apology intended to mend the irreparable damage she had caused. Her hands trembled as she reached for a glass of water, barely able to hold it steady. Throughout her career, Cheryl had prided herself on following the rules and enforcing policies without question, but now she saw that fairness meant nothing if it only applied to those who looked a certain way. The television played quietly in the background, where a news segment covered the flight incident. Photos of Veronica boarding the plane and a blurred video of Cheryl being escorted out dominated the screen. Although Cheryl had never seen herself as a villain, the public was beginning to view her as a stark example of the destructive nature of unchecked bias. Back at headquarters, Veronica began typing a new internal statement, a message meant not for the press, but for every employee who had ever doubted a customer because they did not fit a preconceived image of wealth or status. Her words were gentle yet uncompromising. Respect is not a privilege granted by a job title. It is a basic expectation. If anyone in this company cannot offer that respect equally to every customer, they should not be here, she continued. What happened on Flight 118 is not solely about me. It is about every person who has ever been told, directly or indirectly, that they do not belong. Our goal is not merely to fix a policy, it is to reset our entire culture. After reviewing her statement with painstaking care, Veronica sent it to the internal communications team with clear instructions that it be shared with every employee. She wanted the world to know that this was not about personal vendetta, but about transforming a system steeped in discrimination. The following morning, as the sun began to light up the city skyline, Veronica arrived at headquarters. The halls were quiet, yet the buzz of conversation was palpable. News articles and social media posts had already exploded with headlines proclaiming that an airline CEO had remained composed under fire, that an executive passenger had forced a company-wide policy change overnight, and that a single flight had ignited a movement against racial bias. The 15-second viral video of Cheryl walking past first-class passengers with her rigid posture and pallid face, while Veronica sat unperturbed, had become a powerful symbol. That image was now synonymous with a call for change, a reminder that the way people are treated should be based on their humanity, not their appearance. In her office, Veronica found Leo waiting near her desk, scrolling through his tablet. "We have more than 30 interview requests today," he said quietly. "Talk shows, business panels, and even a national news anchor is offering a private interview." Veronica set her coffee down gently and replied, "This is not a campaign." Leo inquired about internal feedback, and she explained, "We sent out the statement last night. It is being shared like wildfire. Department heads are scheduling sensitivity training, and our policy review team is calling this the biggest employee engagement spike in years." When Leo mentioned that some senior staff felt that I made an example of Cheryl, Veronica's eyes hardened slightly. "I did not make an example of her," she said evenly. "She made herself the example by her actions." Leo added that the former flight attendant, who had been silenced last year, had agreed to speak with HR. Veronica whispered, "We failed her once. Let us not fail her again." Later that week, Veronica returned to the training division's main conference room where directors, trainers, and department leads sat silently, waiting for her to introduce the next phase of her initiative. On the screen behind her, the first slide of the new training module appeared. "Before the uniform, what you see, what you assume, what must change," was emblazoned across the slide. Veronica spoke slowly and clearly. "We do not teach perception, we teach procedures." With a deliberate tap on the remote, she changed the slide to display an empty first-class cabin. "This is what the average crew member sees on any day," she explained. "But for someone who does not match the expected image, every day becomes a test of patience and dignity, a trial to prove their right to be here." The next slide flashed a still image of the moment Cheryl had confronted her during the flight. Veronica let the room absorb the image before continuing. I do not want apologies, I want awareness. Then, unexpectedly, she brought up the written apology from Cheryl and read it aloud for all to hear. I now understand that I doubted your right to be in that space because you did not fit what I expected. That was not about protocol, it was about bias. And I carry that mistake fully. A hand was raised in the back, and one attendee asked if Veronica truly believed the apology meant what it said. After a measured pause, she replied, I do not know, but perhaps hearing it aloud here will inspire someone else to mean it when it counts. When the meeting ended, the room did not empty quickly. People lingered, deep in thought. Some approached Veronica with quiet thanks, while others walked out with faces that spoke of complex emotions, regret, recognition, and a resolve to change. That evening, as Veronica sat by her window watching the city lights blink softly, a new message came through on her phone. It was from Cheryl. Thank you for reading my apology. I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I want to learn if that is still allowed. After a long moment of silence, Veronica typed back, learning is allowed, so is accountability. Let us see what you do next. Her reply was not an act of revenge, but a call for responsibility. In the days that followed, the quiet spark ignited by that single flight grew into a wildfire of conversation. Headlines eventually faded, but the story stayed in the minds of employees and passengers alike. In airport lounges, in break rooms, and during flight attendant training sessions, the name Veronica Taylor was now synonymous not only with a CEO who had stood up to prejudice, but with a movement that demanded respect and fairness. Meetings that were once rigid and formal began to transform into open dialogues, where employees spoke openly about experiences long buried. Stories of silenced voices and unacknowledged biases surfaced, prompting a complete cultural shift. Veronica led by example, attending training workshops as a participant rather than a distant observer. She sat alongside junior employees, asked questions, and listened intently, making it clear that the changes being implemented were not about a single incident, but about decades of ingrained assumptions. The new training module, titled Assumption is Not Policy, was launched within 2 weeks and made mandatory for everyone, from cabin crew to part-time staff. The first slide of the module featured a stark quote, "Bias does not wear a uniform, it wears comfort." Throughout the training, role-play sessions, footage from actual flights, and anonymous employee stories were used to drive home the message that language, tone, and even silence carried powerful messages. During one session, a young trainee named Melissa raised her hand and with a trembling voice asked, "What if we mess up? Even with all this training, what if we still say or do the wrong thing?" Veronica stood and walked to the front of the room. "You will mess up," she said gently, "because that is human. But what matters is that when it happens, you do not double down on your mistakes. Instead, you step back and ask yourself, why did this happen?" Her words resonated like a lighthouse guiding ships through fog. Meanwhile, in a quiet, sunlit conference room away from prying eyes, Cheryl Martin met face to face with Veronica. There was no audience, no formal ceremony, just two individuals confronting the long road from recognition to repair. "I want to thank you for not destroying me," Cheryl said plainly, her voice raw with emotion. "You had every chance, yet you did not." Veronica looked at her steadily and replied, "I did not want to destroy you because I wanted you to understand the damage you almost did." Cheryl, tears welling in her eyes, nodded and said, "I do now. I do not expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to hear me say that I am trying to become someone who treats everyone with the respect they deserve." Veronica offered a quiet, firm response. "Make sure you treat everyone differently, not just people like me." That moment of truth passed between them without fanfare, just a solemn acknowledgement of the long and hard journey toward accountability. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effect of Flight 118 transformed the entire company. The new policies, training sessions, and open dialogues brought about visible change. Employee engagement soared, and feedback from over 20,000 anonymous passenger comments confirmed that the industry was finally moving toward true equality. Veronica Taylor sat in her office one morning, gazing out at a skyline painted in soft blues and silvers, knowing that her father's dream was evolving into something much greater than a business. It was becoming a movement for change. Veronica Taylor reflected on the transformation of her world with quiet determination. For the first time in a long while, she was treated as if she truly belonged. She recalled walking into first class wearing work boots, unashamed and resolute, without fear of judgment or sneers that once stung so deeply. Her assistant Leo reported that Cheryl Martin had completed all 6 advanced training modules, attended 2 weekend forums voluntarily, and even led 3 peer sessions. Her evaluations were exemplary, and passengers now requested her return on flights. Veronica raised an eyebrow at the progress and noted that the woman she had wronged last year had been rehired, though not in her old role, but now on the team that reviewed in-flight conduct reports. Cheryl's first initiative, a faster review process for behavior complaints, was beginning to restore hope among those once overlooked. Later, as Veronica walked through a busy terminal unrecognized, she encountered a young girl who admired her calm stance during that infamous flight. The girl confessed she had watched the video countless times, impressed by Veronica's quiet strength in the face of blatant discrimination. Veronica smiled gently and explained, "I did not shout or curse because true change flows like water, slow, persistent, and powerful enough to carve through stone." Veronica Taylor finally settled into her seat as the plane filled with passengers and the safety announcements began. The engines warmed and she gazed out the window, not at the vast sky, but at the reflection of a woman transformed. Not the woman who once owned an airline with arrogant dismissiveness, nor the one from that unforgettable flight of cruelty and judgment. Today, she saw herself as a champion who turned painful silence into monumental change. As the wheels lifted off the ground, Veronica closed her eyes, not in escape, but in a quiet moment of well-deserved rest. Justice, she realized, did not always roar with thunderous retribution. Sometimes it came softly, like a steady stream carving through granite. She remembered the harsh words and cold stares of her detractors, those who once believed she did not belong, now silenced by the undeniable power of transformation. In that quiet seat, in the right row where no one doubted her presence, everyone finally understood her true worth. Veronica Taylor had become more than a CEO. She was the embodiment of resilience and accountability. Her journey had redefined the culture, and as the plane soared, she allowed herself a gentle, triumphant smile, knowing that true change speaks in quiet, powerful moments.